All right. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you as well, Andrea. All right. And so I'm getting the names down. We're getting into the assignment that's due next Monday in your summer class, and that is the Antebellum Westward expansion. Antebellum just refers to before the war in Latin, and that's before the Civil War of 1861 to 65. But it's predominantly refers to the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. It's a long period of time under that category, about 3 decades that we're talking about. And especially when it comes to the West, when we talk about the antebellum reforms and their alleged contributions to the Civil War, that discussion begins in the 1830s. A lot of reforms did. But when we talk about the West, a lot of it is in the 1840s, 10 years later. All right, as we see here, with the exception of the loss of Texas from Mexico, the whole Alamo story, taking Texas from Mexico, happens in 1836. All right, so as I'm putting this down, I have the same dichotomy that I sometimes do on my assignments. Is the first assignment is a bit court. It's a bit romanticized. And the second section is revisionist. It's more cynical about our nation's generation back then, and leaders back then, and people back then, etc. All right. And so I kind of do that dichotomy a little too often, but it is what it is so far. I want you to be familiar with just the beginnings, as this being an intro to U.S. history class. For those of you who move on to become history majors, those are the 2 broad categories you begin with. All right. So with that in mind, the romanticized section that we begin with is Turner's thesis. A guy named Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s, the U.S. was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival into the New World, into the Caribbean or the Bahamas. And he wanted to romanticize it, and contending, right, that the Native Americans in particular, the American hemisphere, North, Central, and South, it was better off in the long run for the arrival of the Europeans, okay, which of course has taken a stark 180 since then, right, in popular discourse. But back then, that was the romantic view of it, is that Native Americans, aren't you happy that the Europeans arrived? Look at all the progress that they brought with them, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a lot of boasting. There was a World Fair in Chicago on that year, in that commemoration. And then there was a lot with the steam engine and lots of different technological toys that had been invented at that time. And we were showing off as, quote, Euro-American nation, what the old world of Europe had brought to the new world, and to be proud of. And so it was in that type of generation, that type of culture, right, and spirit of that generation, from which this gentleman, this historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, wrote his famous thesis. And in that thesis, right, he brags about the West, the trans-Appalachian, really the trans-Mississippi River West, right? So west of the Mississippi River. And he contends, right, that the West basically renewed what America is all about, right? And to him, America's identity is enveloped in equality of opportunity, right? Or meritocracy, as some people call it. You get what you merit. You get what you work for, what you earn, regardless of your background, regardless of your demographic, right? The category of the population that you're labeled as. But that just by hard work, grit, in a very indiscriminately colorblind society, anyone can make it who earns it, right? Who deserves it, makes it to the top. Like the microcosm of sports, right? Whoever can make it to the top, regardless of organization's name, reputation, legacy, financial resources, etc. Whoever keeps winning in the league, in the tournament, etc., and continues to knock out competitors, eventually prevails. And so to him, that's what America was all about. And America had somewhat lost its way east of the Mississippi River early in American history, when they had ensconced themselves, certain demographics, as the local aristocracies of their area, right? And aristoi means the best in Greek. So they had the best opportunities. They gained access to the best land. And we talked about that earlier in class, like with the gentry class in particular, coming from England to Virginia and Maryland in particular in the South, and taking the lion's share of the best Tidewater land, taking over most of the government positions, getting most of the contracts, the most lucrative trade and mercantilist contracts, right, for business, and having the best opportunities that weren't open to everybody else. But supposedly he says that when the West opened up, it opened up meritocracy like it had never been open, perhaps except for in the first generation or two of colonization of the Americas in the 1600s. That it did it again, and it did it in a widespread, permanently identifiable in altering way, right, to make this country a land of opportunity. And so how does that happen, right? Is, well, for one, you look at, again, 1843 was a big year. 1843, you had some major movements across land, particularly across a path that had become popular by the written word through stories like Robert Stewart from the War of 1812, who had traveled across this northern route, the 2,000-mile route across the West, which would later become known as the Oregon Trail. And like I said, publicity with churches, publicity with organizations moving missionaries and to the West, through also the joint stock companies that were involved in fur trading in particular, the Muscovy Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and many others in the Oregon Territory, for instance. You had people like the Spaniard, oh gosh, his name is evading me at the moment, but there was a Spaniard who began paying lots of money to advertise for workers on the East Coast to come all the way to the Oregon Territory and try to work as day laborers and get paid well and on commission for catching pelts of one type or another, because they were selling at 800% profit during the 1820s in China, the particular beaver and otter pelts. And so the fur trading business just took off in the 1820s. And so a lot of freelance and, capitalistic Americans moved to the West during the 1820s to get a piece of the pie, if you will. And then a lot of them, like John Jacob Astor, who was a German immigrant to the US, began going their own direction. Once they saved up a little bit of money, they left their employers and they began their own companies, their own fur trading companies, their own fishing companies, et cetera, in the far West. And so that helped. Again, it just had this effect whereby you hear the fortunes of people like John Jacob Astor and others, and it just encouraged more and more people to head to the far West amidst the 1820s. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 put a lot of interest in the trans-Mississippian West as well at that time. And then again, like I said, drama with Mexico but long before the drama, in the 1820s and in the early 1830s, there was a lot of interest in Mexican Texas, as you'll read in number 2, because there were a lot of inducements that were offered by the Mexican government, including large parcels of very cheap, in some cases, free land, and very fertile land, I might add as well, in southeastern Texas, where it's very humid and almost tropical. And so at any rate, a lot of things were combining in the 1820s and 1830s to draw interest. But again, 1843 was a big year in evoking a lot of interest in the Oregon Trail in particular. You have the famous mountain men. They're going to come up and become very famous for their connections with the native world, their connections with the Mississippian West, with its ecosystems and all its conditions and so forth. And so they're going to be paid handsomely for telling their stories about how they made it in the West. They're going to be paid handsomely for working as guides to help lead people through the West, because they had connections, linguistic and alliance connections with various Native American tribes whose territory they traversed. They knew the shortcuts and the ins and outs of all the different land areas, because as you know, you have to go through the northern or southern plains, then you get to the Rocky Mountains, then you go through the Great Plateau or Great Basin, Desert Basin, then you get to the Sierra Nevada foothills, and then finally into or the Mandan Mountains above them, and then finally into the far west. And so there was a lot of things to be able to confront and survive, and going across these routes that became known as the California Trail, or Mormon Trail, the Oregon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail in the south. And so again, I mean, you look at Mac Garriger, you look at oh goodness, I have several. I don't know where they are, of course, at this very moment, but I have some books that are, I wish I'd had them ready so I could point them out to you immediately. That just very interesting. I don't have them in their proper spot, and I apologize. But Mac Farragher, you have White, who has It's Your Misfortune and None of My Own. You have Patricia Limerick, are some big historians on the West, on the Trans-Appalachian West. And then you have your basic textbooks out of many, Alan Brinkley's book that I use when we use a textbook, etc. So at any rate, you have information on the overland trails and the leaders of those, the leaders that became infamously connected to those overland trails, and making them more familiar and utilized by that generation in the 1840s. And then you also have, the fact that we're going to have the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 48. And then within just, let's see here, February 2nd of 1848 was a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War. January 24th, just 8 days before the end of the war officially, they discovered gold, right, in California. So the timing was incredible, right? At the very last week of the war, gold was discovered. And so gringos, Anglos, just flooded in to California in particular, right at the end of the Mexican-American War. And so what he contends, right, and with these overland trails and with the post-Mexican-American War settlement into the far West, is that there were indiscriminate, and indiscriminate is a very important integral part to his thesis, right? Is that there was no playing the favorites, right? There's no discriminating. but that there were indiscriminate dangers and indiscriminate opportunities for those who are moving into the far West, right? So the indiscriminate dangers, why would he highlight those? It's kind of like Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero's journey when he talks about myths and legends of multiple civilizations. As he contends, right, that nothing ventured, nothing gained. That the goal of economic success is not as praiseworthy if it's not difficult to obtain. And so, so the fact that there were indiscriminate dangers, right, it romanticizes this thesis and saying that a lot of people didn't make it, a lot of people died. When you look at the death rates, official death rates, and most people would agree that they are not emblematic of the true death rates, because it just happens that way. Is not all deaths, quite a few deaths occurred, and people were sadly, obscurely buried along the side of the trails without letting any of the officials know in the next census report back in California or New Mexico or Oregon, etc. And so, but nevertheless, most people agree that more people died along the trails than they give credit for along these major trails. And you had treacherous waters. You had the Platte River, you had the Snake River, you had the Columbia River, and multiple people drowned in those rivers. I wouldn't begin to know if I could say thousands, but for certain hundreds. A lot of people drowned in those rivers in the 1840s alone. Then you had historians like Candy Moulton, and he talks about how a lot of people were, I don't know how he gets his stats, but he looks at primary sources of people who were hiring people to go out and grab the cattle, because it didn't become official until Rutherford B. Hayes was president. But our presidents began to have an open policy with roaming Spanish cattle and buffalo, and saying that they were free for the hunting for Americans traversing through the West. And so that's exactly what Americans tried to do. But a lot of them, according to written sources, were killed by buffalo, by cattle, etc., with the elements, frostbite and freezing to death along the plains at certain times of the year, cave-ins, exhaustion, rock slides, and other accidents. Animals, going back to the Lewis and Clark expedition much earlier, bears went after people and killed them. There was a big species of bear in the far West that was known to be very violent and aggressive toward human trespassing. And so you have those types of things, poisonous snake bites, etc., that are documented to have happened. And the idea is, again, right, is that it didn't matter who you were on the East Coast or back in Europe, how much money you brought with you. You were equally liable to falling prey to these dangers as anybody else was. So it was indiscriminate. There was no favoritism, right? And so it leveled the playing field, so to speak. And then in addition to that, you have Native American activity that sometimes could either like the Crow Native American tribe were infamous during this generation, according to the primary sources written down, for extortion. If you were in a small number enough of a party, they would surround you, threaten to kill you if you did not hand over whatever you had to offer, whatever they had that was of interest to them. So many horses, so much of your flour and food, et cetera, or they would threaten to shoot you on the spot. And of course, right, by the 1840s, easily by then, most Native Americans all the way throughout the far West had gained trade access to white man's guns. And so there wasn't much of a disparity in weaponry between the Anglos and the Native Americans. And so that posed a threat. Along the southern trail, the Santa Fe Trail, there were at least three, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Navajo. All three became infamous for killing people white trespassers through their territory in the Southwest. And so you had those types of things to contend with, right? And then you also had the fact that at the end of the Mexican-American War, President Polk refused to follow the Northwest ordinances, which was supposed to divvy out in 6-acre square plots land that was taken, captured, won in war, like in this case against Mexico. And the Land Survey Office was to divvy it out by way of a public auction, and have so many of them consist of a town, so many of those consist of a county, and then establish the proper city and regional legal institutions. So like a city council and a mayor, a sheriff or constable with some type of police force, etc. That was not followed. Polk was in too much of a hurry, wanting Americans to grab that land from the Mexican people in California in particular. When gold was discovered at the end of the war, and the famous gold nugget was delivered to him on the East Coast, he opened up the West for the taking. And it created this rat race that made things even more wild than they already were. And so hence that you didn't have a lot of certainty as far as who owned what land and the divvying out of property. And you also did not have many legal institutions, whereby in some of these mining towns, they never established a constable, a sheriff, a police force, etc. So that there literally was no law and order in some of these mining towns here in California. And so you have evidence for that. And again, Frederick Jackson Turner romanticizes this and says that this created a Wild West. But again, right, if you were, and I think I put it here, right here, in line with Turner's thesis, there in red, the tough, the intelligent, the well-prepared, the adaptive, survived and even thrived amidst this dangerous trek, right? And so what could you do? Well, for one, right, is you like, again, if you were very business savvy, etc., if you saw a need or a desire and quickly capitalized on it, you could succeed. And so, for instance, they called it mining the miners, right? When the miners first came in, and by the way, in 1848, not the famous 49ers, but in 1848, you look at the famous book, The World Rushed In, by J.S. Holiday, arguably still the most famous book on the gold rush. You look at other people. Oh, goodness. Again, I have them back behind me, but I don't want to take the time to disruptively walk back and find it. But a gentleman that teaches at the University of Texas has a great book or two on the gold rush as well, more up to date, etc., and modern. But at any rate, they contend that they're in 1848, the people who first got to the diggings, the gold was superficial. It was in the riverbeds, right, of the American River, the Feather River, and these other, the Consumnes River, etc., especially in the Sacramento Valley. And so the first people here got lucky. They were able to extract it according to the primary sources, like the Spanish newspapers of Mexican California. They're in its last days. They contended that there was no skill needed. There was no technical expertise needed. There was no fancy machinery needed. You could extract it from the bottom of the rivers. And so that didn't last long, needless to say, but some who were here quickly enough, were able to benefit from that. And likewise with subsequent rushes. You had a silver rush in Nevada, right, with a Comstock lode and so forth in the 1860s, a little bit later. The 1870s in North and South Dakota, etc. So at any rate, there was gold actually in the Dakotas. But but you also could mine the miners. You find a manner by which something that was in high demand for them. And so they're away from their families. We know this from their writings because we established post offices, right, across the country to try to help them. We established military forts to try to help give them directions, maps, have an opportunity to get food, provisions, even weapons and guns, etc. And we know from their communication that they were homesick, a lot of them, very lonesome, etc. And so people capitalized on that, and they tried to bring them refinement. They brought, plays and established theaters. They provided, billiards for playing pool and playing cards. Of course, they offered alcohol and prostitution and brothels, etc. And so a lot of people made a lot of money off of that. Inns where they could stay and have a nice shower or have a nice bath and meal in bed to sleep in a breakfast to eat in the morning, etc. And so people mining the miners became a very lucrative business. If you were quick enough on your feet and able to get some type of capital, right? Some type of loan. And then, of course, this is going to really speed up this entrepreneurial route to the American dream when the railroads come in at the end of the Civil War, just a few decades later. But still here, mining the miners was a lucrative way toward the American dream, for sure. All right. And grabbing land. From the time of Andrew Jackson's time period of the late 1820s and early 1830s, judge positions became more and more elected, whereby they're going to want to make popular decisions, right, to become reelected as the local judges. And a lot of the poor white Anglos are hungry for land. And so squatters' rights increased under the English common law that we had derived them from, whereby, for instance, if you had gone so many years as the rightful owner of property and were guilty of neglect and not cultivating the said land, even though it was clear that on paper that you owned it, there were variations at local areas interpreting the rights of the squatters who came and just squatted on that land of yours. And sometimes they would have first option rights to purchase it from you. Certain times they would have certain amount of time that they were given before they had to leave. And in some cases, if you had not improved it in a certain amount of time, they had the right to take it from you, believe it or not. So it varied from place to place, but it was evolving in our legal system, whereby squatters' rights were getting more and more obtrusive into the rights of the rightful owners of the property, right? Because that was kind of a populist thing to do, is to just the lowest common denominator, appeal to the greed of the poor white voters to get their votes. And so at any rate, this happens especially with the Mexican American, the Latino landowners in California and New Mexico, the grandees who own thousands of acres of land, especially when a lot of that land was not cultivated, but it was pastoral, where they would just have sheep or cattle roaming it. And they would make the argument to the local judge, hey, he's not using it. He's not improving it. He's not cultivating it. And they began parceling out a lot of that Latino gentleman's land to these poor, ambitious, greedy squatters, Anglo squatters on parcels of his land. And so that was all a part of the American dream. But of course, as it says in number 2, that was at the expense of another demographic of Latinos. But that is conveniently overlooked in number 1. So you see, number 1 is just romanticized, saying that the West renewed American meritocracy. The West renewed American equality of economic opportunity, right? That the dangers were indiscriminate and that the opportunities were indiscriminate. So it didn't matter who you were, color of your skin, etc. Right? As long as you capitalized on those opportunities, as long as you were tough and lucky enough to overcome those obstacles in the West, then the opportunity was there for you, and that supposedly is what America is all about. So a very romanticized thesis. Okay. And as I told you right off the bat, number 2 is revisionist. It takes a 180 from that and says equality of opportunity. What about in particular for Latino people? So in this one, you get the story of the Alamo. So please, even if you choose one to work on, for the sake of test 3, read number 2, okay? And familiarize yourself with the story of the Alamo and the story of the Mexico's loss of Texas, because there's a lot of information in it that leans toward a Chicano perspective of Chicano history, of conflict history, right? Of the bad guys taking land from, power from the victims, who are the Latinos. Notice at least the pretext, or at least the so-called excuse for the rebellion, was in Santa Anna's Siete Leyes constitution, which did take away representative government and local government and dissolve some checks and balances. So it really was quite kind of destructive of liberal traditions. And I could see how it could cause alarm for people in Texas. But that's just part of the story. So read the rest of it. Then look for evidence of when we're fighting the Mexican-American War. Look for evidence with our politicians, right? With our newspapers of clear racism, right? And prejudice. So you see it here in this paragraph right here. The New York Herald depicted the Mexican people as imbeciles. That's a New York right newspaper. Degraded by miscegenation. California governor exclaimed that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races. Yikes. The Mexican character is made up of stupidity, obstinacy, ignorance, duplicity, and vanity. Very indicting stuff against the US in the 1840s. And then this paragraph deals with, like I said, despite the fact that there was a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that guaranteed Mexican Americans their constitutional rights, as well as including their property, right? That did not work out in practice, particularly pertaining to their property. So again, then it goes backward to the loss of Texas, then into the war, the Mexican-American War, and how it was arguably provoked by the US. And then after the war, amidst the gold rush era, foreign miners' taxes, lynching, the term proletarianization, the fact that Latinos were pigeonholed into the proletariat, into Karl Marx's class of blue-collared laborers working in physical labor that has little to no avenue for socioeconomic ascension, moving up. that's highly exploited, that's not paid well. So they worked the railroads, they worked in the mines. And then, of course, by the early 1900s, that a lot of them would be pigeonholed into the fields, into the new agricultural plantations. And you see there at the bottom, consequently, Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis about the West opening equality of opportunity or meritocracy conveniently omits the obvious fact that Hispanics, among other demographics, were deprived of equal opportunities in pursuing the American dream. So how could there be equality of opportunity when Americans coveted Mexican land and took it from them, parcel by parcel, first Texas, then the entire far West, 10 years later. And see this right here on May 25th, 1836, future President John Quincy Adams, currently serving in the House, gave a telling speech, right, of a vicious cycle of racial intolerance and lust for others' lands. That elected politicians were fanning the flames of racism among their constituents, using people of other ethnic extractions as in quote, other, against which white Americans could feel a sense of unity. Knowing that most American settlers in the Mexican lands were originally from the South, Congressman Adams saw a pattern of political pandering to poor whites' ambition for land, as well as their xenophobia, being from the South, thereby embroiling Americans into wars with others with whom future relations would be further soured. Is there not yet hatred enough between the races which compose your southern population and the population of Mexico? Adams rhetorically asked Polk. As with Native Americans in the 1830s, Adams recognized lust for land and xenophobic animosity as the quote glue that united those Americans who supported the Mexican-American War. Antebellum writer Herman Melville also wrote a sense of American delirium and fighting bloody wars against perceived outsiders for their land. So number 2 is clearly going against Turner's thesis, saying there was no such thing as equality of opportunity, because that generation made it clear that certain demographics were not welcome to pursue the American dream. And in this particular case, we're focusing on Mexican Americans. So yeah, to be honest, I don't look forward to this lesson. It just makes me feel uncomfortable as your instructor. Just in light of number 2 alone, there's a lot of ugliness there. All right, so do you guys feel okay as far as being prepared for this? Any thumbs up? Thank you. Thank you again. Any questions?
Hi, Professor. I have a quick question pertaining to the assignment due on Friday, tomorrow.
Sure.
That one is only one section, correct?
That's right.
Okay, good. Because I was like, maybe it didn't download correctly.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it is. I
It's okay.
believe it's the only one you don't really have a choice. It's just one section. Yeah.
Okay, and I also wanted to ask if there was any chance that you can share with us the document for test number 3. I know you told us last time to keep reminding you if you can post it for us.
Of course. Of course.
That way, when we're reading it, I can go back and see, oh, this might help me with this question.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
No, I'm writing it down right now. Thank you for reminding me. All right. Yeah, I'll be happy to post test 3. Okay. So anybody else before we say goodbye today? All right. So remember, this is due and for this particular semester next Monday night, the 8th of August. So on the 9th of August, we'll meet at 3 and we will do the alleged causes of the Civil War. All right, so I have your names. If you guys have no questions to ask, I'm going to go ahead and let you go, okay? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor, I did have one more question
Sure.
pertaining to our grades. Are our grades going to be posted towards the end of the semester?
Yes, I'm so
Got
sorry
it.
how much I have been yeah. I got a lot to catch up on. I apologize.
No, it's okay. I was just wondering because I'm always looking back. I was like, maybe he posted a grade.
No, you're not missing anything. I'm sorely behind, for which I have no excuse. I'm sorry, Valeria.
No, it's okay. It's a summer class. It gets a little hectic sometimes. But okay, have a good weekend. I
You as
appreciate
well.
it.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
patience.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.